Welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor, and today I'm going to talk about a few things that I use regularly with color strategies, and some of the ways I think about color, some of the ways I use color to enhance a mood or create a feeling of light with the media of watercolor. And I'm going to start with an exercise. In this exercise, I'm using the primary hues, the primary colors. I'm going to make three small circles of yellow, but these circles of yellow are varied in that they go from the darker aspect of yellow to a medium strength and then to a very pale yellow, working from right to left. And then I'm going to follow that with layering some color on top. This is one of the techniques that we use in watercolor. Some of us learn this way, where we build up our image in layers of color or layers of paint, and in this way we can take advantage of one of the properties of working with watercolor, which is its transparency. And what I hope to show you is a few ways of working with color and some working thoughts about how to use color in your painting to achieve different effects, and also in some ways to think about color. You can see I'm finishing up these little circles using a cadmium yellow, a alizarin crimson, and I believe this is ultramarine blue. In any case, a red, a yellow, and a blue. And then I return to the circles after they've dried, and I'm adding a transparent, a very light wash of cobalt blue to all of these, or I shouldn't say light wash to all of them. I'm using cobalt blue on top of the yellows and the reds, and then I'll add a neutral tint on top of the blue. What I want to show you in this exercise is that we try to match the intensity. I think matching the intensity of the yellow with the blue, meaning that I'm strengthening the blue as I move to the right. I'm adding more pigment. The pigment's getting thicker. So what that does is the vibration between the two colors is a little more equal, and they support each other. The one on the left, the far left, perhaps the blue is just a little strong, and it's good to see that as well. And this is a kind of strategy when I do an underpainting and the colors, on the strong side. I know that I'm going to follow it with a strong dark, because otherwise it would have very little effect on the underpainting. So I try to match the intensity of colors as they're applied onto the underpainting. If it's very light, I usually go very light with the color on top. And you can see how the underpainting is affecting the mixed area, the area where the two intersect. You get a warm coming through the cool, and it creates a vibration, it creates interest, it creates depth in the color. And this is, I would say, one of the real strengths of watercolors is the transparent nature, using transparencies to create exciting washes through the painting. Later on we'll apply this to a scene, but I wanted to show you this exercise, and I can recommend this to you because it will allow you to get to know your colors more intimately. Everybody seems to have a different array of colors, different manufacturers, different types of color. So getting to know your colors is important. And we do this through experience, and this sort of drill is really invaluable, because all you have to think about is the layering of color, and you can really take in a lot of information that way and see the results happen in front of you. This next exercise that I'm doing is we can paint with mixtures in a couple of different ways. We can mix the color on the palette. We can mix the color on the paper, and there's a different result, and you should know that result, because sometimes you want a quieter wash, sometimes you want a more varied, exciting wash, and we have those options. So what I'm doing now is that upper circle was mixed on the palette. It's a violet color made of alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue, mixed very thoroughly on the palette. The second one was mixed on the paper, and the third one was mixed by carrying two colors on the brush and making a circle and then spreading a little water over it. So these sorts of drills, I think, are great ways to get to know your own colors and see how they behave together. Gives you an immediate sense of what they mean by sedentary colors or transparent or opaque colors, and you'll be able to use that information in your painting. So it's a good drill to go through. This has been my motif for the past several weeks, and I'm going to use it again, the Trinity Church in Boston. We're seeing it here in a little different light, a more dramatic light with some very strong shadows, and this is my tonal study of that scene. So I'm very much focused on the light, and in this painting I would like to do an underpainting, a painting primarily of warm hues through the buildings, with the idea that after it dries off, I'm going to create those deep angular shadows with cooler hues. So right away, I'm kind of stating one of the strategies in working with color in general, whether you're a watercolorist or oil painter, pastel artist. But since we're making use of transparency, I'm going to be balancing cool against warm, warm against cool, and that juxtaposition heightens the effect. It makes the warm colors, the underpainting, feel warmer. It makes the cool colors that follow feel a bit cooler, and also creates a certain depth in those colors by utilizing the underpainting and watercolor's nature of transparency. So this whole building is being given an application of yellow ochre, some alizarin crimson, some cad red light, and some pale, maybe even a bit of cad yellow there. Plus, near that archway, I've left a bit of white paper to create some shimmer later on. But the strategy is to paint this underlayer with sort of a light to mid-value tone of warm hues. And they could be any warm hues. These are the ones that I favor, the alizarin crimson and the cad yellow and cad red. And while this is drying, I'm putting a little bit of a wash onto the blue of the sky. Actually, it's already dried, so I can get some nice hard edges there. And I've extended that wash to the right into the building that is across the way from the Trinity Church. And you can already see that the blue is having a little different finish to it. The pink is coming through on the building on the right, and this is part of the strategy, is to balance warm against cool and evoke the transparent nature of watercolor. Adding a little bit more of this deep blue to the distant building, and I'll be grading it even more with some darker hues as it starts to dry. This is to, again, create a feeling of luminosity in the lower part of the painting, where there's a lot of light bouncing around, and it's even though we're painting a lot of shadows, within those shadows there's a lot of interesting color and a feeling of light and transparency in the shadows. That's what I'm really after. So I'm starting now. It's again, it's dry paper, and I'm highlighting some of the shapes that I want to focus on, and the others I'm really just applying a lot of this. It looks very strong, but it's actually kind of a mid-value gray. And by gray I mean a hue that's been broken. It's got some warmth to it. It's probably a mixture of ultramarine blue and a little bit of alizarin crimson, as well as some burnt sienna, primarily a cool gray. And that's coming on top of all these warm hues. So not only will it give a feeling of the shape of the shadow, some interesting shapes, but as it dries, these pale warm hues will start to come through and create a bit of luminosity. So one of the things I want to mention about color while I'm working on these shadows here is that by our nature, I think we want to replicate the color that we see in nature. We want to follow that, but it's a real danger to do that. I feel maybe for the watercolor artist in particular, because as you know, when we paint a hue, it looks one way when it goes on the paper, and then in 10 minutes we turn around and it's gotten much lighter, or it's changed. So it's very hard to paint that way, where you're trying to measure one color against your subject and do that and make a completed painting out of that. It leads to more frustration than it's worth. My strategy is more to think about where the color's warm, where the color's cool, and where the value of that color is intense and where it's pale, and to try to emulate that when I'm evaluating my subject to paint it. I look for an overriding hue, a color that seems to be dominant in the scene, and I let that color enter almost all the mixtures. So if it's, in this case, there's a lot of warm hues, and certainly from the beginning the warm hues were plentiful. As I'm coming back with these grays, yes, some part of these hues are cool, bluish, but there's also been some alizarin crimson added to these mixtures, and that'll come through as the painting dries. So I look for an overriding color, and I try to include that color in the mixtures, and that builds a sort of consistency to the painting, and it really holds any of the other hues together. If you can find that color, I think Joseph Zabukovic calls it the mother color, and certainly you hear other artists refer to that as well. It's something that I look for when I'm evaluating the subject to paint it. And I work that into my watercolor plan as well. And then the second thing is I don't try to match color too much. I try to approximate it, but I really don't try to get an exact green or an exact blue or an exact yellow. I try to approximate it, and I find I'm much happier in the painting process, and usually much happier with the result, even though it's not photographic. In fact, I think it ends up being more striking and more enjoyable from a color point of view than a photograph. And so that's become my, if you will, my color philosophy, the way that I work with color. I probably qualify as more of a tonalist because I do tend to think and sketch in a single color, and I enjoy that very much. Sometimes I feel that single color captures the light and the essence of the subject in a more meaningful way. But I do enjoy working with color too, and I like the results when it's working. Here you can see that violet hue has really been carried everywhere and is kind of surrounding the luminous area of the Trinity Church, and giving me some beautiful shapes. Again, when I'm applying the strokes, the strokes of that color. I'm trying to think as a calligrapher might think and make each stroke count, whether it's up in the spires or traversing a rooftop or coming under an eave. Whatever it is, I try to be brief about it, be sure about it, and if it doesn't come out exactly according to plan, I don't stress about it and fiddle with it. I pretty much accept it and move on. If it's really glaring, at the end of the painting I might scrub it down a little or tone it down a little, but in general I try to keep whatever goes on and keep it fresh in that aspect. This stage of the painting is quite nice, seeing how this dark middle tone is creating the light in the scene. The light trails in from the right side. You can see that little pathway of light that I've left and rides up the building and even onto some distant trees. And very evocative of this time of day, when we see the low light and the long shadows. It's a very beautiful moment in nature, and seems to find its way into a lot of my paintings. So we're getting into some smaller areas and have to be a little careful. I still try to keep that same tempo with my brush, which means that kind of darting in and out and placing little marks and then moving out and shaping this shadow in a really meaningful way. Also, you notice as soon as I add some of those strong darks under the entrances, the whole shadow becomes much more transparent and feels like it's settled on the building, and you can see, actually as it's drying now, you can start to see some of those warmer hues start to come through. It's really not very visible until the whole painting is dried off, but I believe that I used the right strength in applying that medium tone, and so now I can start to see some of the transparency happen in watercolor. I do like working with stronger hues and trying to get, especially the sorts of lighting conditions that I enjoy. The stronger hues are sometimes hard for the watercolorist. If you're working from cakes of watercolor, or if your watercolor is hardened in your palette, which is pretty common, it's really hard to easily access these darker hues. So what I recommend everyone do is squirt out a little fresh color onto your palette, either the morning that you're going to work or right before you work. This will allow you to get these darker hues very quickly, and you won't spend valuable minutes trying to loosen up the pigment on the palette and get it dark enough. Usually what happens is you scrub and scrub at this rock of color, and it gets close, and you say, oh, that's close enough, and then you add the color to the painting, and it fades about 20%. So having a little fresh color on your palette just makes painting these dark hues much easier, and so that's what I recommend. These figures that I'm adding are almost it's almost pigment right from the tube. They're mostly to give a scale and a feeling that there's activity in front of the church. Some dry brush now to create the the dramatic windows that are part of this architecture, a very recognizable part of the church. So I want to get them relatively correct in position and length, and also they help me to create a little bit of transparency in the shadows. With each painting, I'm getting to know my motif better and better. This series that you're watching is, most of the paintings for class are using this motif of the Trinity Church in different lights and different weather conditions. I hope you're not getting tired of it. I know that I continue to find a lot of enjoyment in painting it. I'm getting to know it to the point where I can almost, I can at least paint the major features without seeing it. And it's not necessarily that I'm bragging about that. It's that what happens as a result, when you get to know your subject this well, you're much more able to improvise and much more able to respond to what's happening with the watercolor. So I'm very pleased that we've been working with a single subject these past weeks, and I believe, based on what I'm seeing come out of class, that this is really a positive way to work with any subject. Is take time to get to know it to the point where you can really perform it as a musician would perform a piece of music. We'll have a look at how it's dried, and you can see those warm hues now coming through, shining through the shadows on the building, coming through the pavement, and coming through the different parts of the painting. So this is an example of some of the ways that I think of color, some of the ways that I use color, and I hope it helps your watercolor painting.